All right, guys, good morning. Welcome back. We have about 3 minutes till class time, but thanks for being here a few minutes early. Just getting the stream ready, and hope you're having a good week. Thanks for your essays. I'm sure all of you guys have been able to turn them in. And we'll be getting going in just a few, so good to see you guys. Good morning. Hey there, Leo. Welcome back. Hi, Ketan, Mia, Janice. Welcome, everybody. Mark, hey, Brandon, Jason, Naaman, good to see you there. Hey, Jerry. What's up, Peachy? Hi, Allison, Angel, everybody. Good to see everyone. Peachy. Well, Leo, my thought was to have it be due at class time. But I mean, if you're just having a little trouble with the sending of the document, probably you're not going to need too much extra time, right? Like, as long as you get it to me, reasonably soon, like before the end of class time would be great. But if it comes in the next hour or something, that would be all right. But I mean, yeah, just do your best to get it ASAP, and I won't deduct unless it's significantly later than class time. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, hi guys. Beach. Oh yeah, sorry, Sebastian, I didn't see your question. Wanted to double check how to turn in. Yeah, emailing is definitely how you're supposed to turn it in. Yes, please email it to me, rvulich@fullerton.edu. There's no other way to submit it. Okay, guys, welcome back. Okay, we're good to go. Thanks everyone for being here, and it's good to see you guys. As you can see, Peachy's just kind of making herself comfortable. But anyway, thanks again, everyone. So as you know, today is the due date of the first essay. So if you haven't already, please do make sure to send it to me right away. My email address is listed in the syllabus, and you know it. It's my name, rvulich@fullerton.edu. So this morning, I didn't have a chance before class because I just taught from 8:30 to 9:45. I didn't have a chance to go through my inbox and just send all the confirmations of those that I've received since last night. So the last time I went through and said, thank you for your email, sorry for your essay, was last night when I went to bed. So right after class though, at 11:15, I'm gonna go back through the list and I'll send off confirmation to all those essay submissions that I've not yet been able to get to. But please do, make sure you send me your essay. It's due today. And now that that's done, the class moves on. The next thing that we look forward to is the midterm. The midterm is Tuesday of week 9. That's March 23rd. So we have a couple weeks of meetings until then. We have to do a little bit more work on the ethics topic, and we're going to have some lectures on that. And then we'll have a review session. I'll give you guys your study guide for the midterm, and we'll take that exam on the 23rd. For now, I'll be working on grading all your guys' papers. It might take me a little bit of time because I have a lot of grading to do, but not to worry. I'll make sure to try and get it all done by next weekend, and you'll have plenty of time before the midterm knowing your score. And if you want comments or anything else, I'll give you those for your first paper. So anyway, we're looking at the calendar and we're all on schedule. The plan today then is that we're going to actually lecture on the work of Peter Singer. So taking stock of where we are at in the semester, we've started with philosophy of religion. And then we segued into the topic of ethics. We learned a little bit about two big ethical theories, Utilitarian Ethics, that's John Stuart Mill's view, And then Kantian Ethics, the theory of morality given by Immanuel Kant that we just finished with. Of course, there are major differences between the two kinds of theory. Mill says that you should always take the action that leads to the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. Kant says you should just try to act with a good will, which means to act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. And the moral law, he thinks, is revealed to us through reason when we apply the categorical imperative to our behavior. The categorical imperative is a principle where there's two versions of it. The first one says, act always according to the maxim that could be willed to be a universal law. So act always so that the maxim that describes your action could be a universal law. Meaning that you should consider the principle that you're acting on, and then consider what would be the case if that was the universal law that binds everybody in the same circumstances. If it would be possible for all to act accordingly, then that's not wrong. But if it's either not possible or not desirable for all to act that way, then that's something that violates the moral law. And the second version of the so like, for example, if telling a lie to get a loan, you're lying about repaying, if that was the universal rule instead of the exception, then there would no longer be any loans because lenders would know that everyone lies when they promise to repay. So then the liar here herself would not be able to have success in telling the lie. So it becomes impossible if everybody does it, and that's why you know it's wrong. Just like if everybody cuts a line or if everybody takes a free ride on the subway or a train, whatever. And the other version of the categorical imperative was that you should never treat a human being as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself. An end is a goal. Means are the things that you do to achieve goals. And so it says there, you're never supposed to use a human person as though they're just a tool or an instrument to be exploited or manipulated in the pursuit of a goal that you may have. So it would be wrong to like use all manner of force, fraud, coercion, and exploitation, deception to use people basically to get things that you want for yourself. Okay, so we move ahead, and the next thing we're doing is we're going to use these ethical theories that we've studied to try and consider an actual moral dilemma and debate in the world. So the issue of moral significance that I want us to kind of look at, which is in our book, is the case of economic inequality. And in specific, do we in the first world have any kind of moral obligation to provide some measure of assistance to the third world poor, to those that live in absolute poverty? So again, do we have an obligation to assist the poor in the third world? And you're going to find that not everyone has the same opinion on that in philosophy. Some, like today's author, make the argument that we do have a moral obligation to provide aid to the poor, to the global poor. But we'll see the other side of that next week on Tuesday. Garrett Hardin says to the contrary, that we don't have a moral obligation to assist the global poor. And in fact, he goes even further and says that he doesn't even think it's actually in anybody's benefit, and that it's not really helpful in the long run if you consider the consequences of international aid. But we'll see both sides of this argument, and we're starting with the side given by this man, Peter Singer. So today's author, the author of the day, the author du jour, Peter Singer. So this is an Australian philosopher well, he's still alive. He was born in 1942, still going strong. And in 1993, he wrote the essay that we're going to examine, and it's just called Rich and Poor. Rich and Poor by Peter Singer, great Australian moral philosopher of the current day. Just plugging in my phone real fast. Peachy's so funny. Okay. I mean, this is just, Peachy's just like there the whole time, just so you guys know, like this is what's happening like, as I'm lecturing. But anyway, she's too cute. Okay. Rich and Poor, Peter Singer, 1993. So just a little bit of background on Mr. Peter Singer. He's, like I said, an Australian philosopher still living. He's considered probably one of the most world-famous living philosophers. He taught at Princeton for a long time and other elite institutions. He's well known in the field of ethics, and he writes on all kinds of subjects in ethics. In the 1970s, when he was a pretty young philosopher, he wrote a book that became a classic, which is called Animal Liberation. So if you know anything about that book, it's considered a classic because it's one of the first detailed arguments by a Western author making the case for like moral vegetarianism and all of that. So he makes the argument based on utilitarian ethical theory in that book that we have a moral obligation to change our practices with regard to like animal treatment, factory farming. And that's an issue that was not on the top of like social consciousness in the 70s, but it's become a much bigger deal today. As you guys probably know, there's a lot of interest in vegetarianism, veganism, wellness, and all of that. So his book kind of was a big spark towards that growing movement. But he's written on all kinds of topics all throughout ethics, including this one, which is the question I mentioned. Do we have any type of moral obligation to assist the global poor in the third world? Okay, so let's get into his argument. He does say in the end, to just kind of preview his conclusions, that we have a moral obligation to assist the global poor. And we'll see why he thinks that's the case. Okay, so beginning his paper, he just wants to lay out certain facts about global poverty so that the reader understands the seriousness of the situation and what it really is. So he begins with the definition of a term called absolute poverty. Absolute poverty. So absolute poverty is a phrase that was first coined by former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. And what it refers to is living in a state where, or living in a condition where you do not have enough income or wealth to meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. So here's the definition then. Not having enough income or wealth, so I'll just put slash to meet the basic human needs of these three main basic things of food, clothing, and shelter. Okay, hold on, teacher. Yeah. Oh, so question here, William, it's email, rvulich@fullerton.edu. Please email me your paper, that's right. Everything's email. Send me an email. I'm typing in my email address just so it's totally clear. I know you probably have professors and stuff that are saying, hey, send me stuff on Canvas, this, that, and the other. I don't like Canvas, and I'm not using it. So you just got to email me like in the old days, I guess. Email's old school now, but that's what I want. I want emails. Thank you. Okay, so you see this definition, not having enough income or wealth to meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. That's absolute poverty. Because this is poverty by any human standard. We're not talking about you feel poor relative to somebody else who has even more wealth than you. In our country, you know, as many of us can look at others that have even more wealth, right? And you can see someone living on a mansion on the hill and you can feel like, wow, they have a lot more money than me. They can do anything they want, travel anywhere, buy whatever they want. And in comparison to them, you may say, I feel like I'm pretty poor. But we're not talking about poverty in the relative sense. We're talking about poverty from the standpoint of absolute human needs. So these are people who, even giving all their income and wealth derived from whatever source, labor, family, wherever, even after using all of it to spend on the basic needs, eating, having clothes on your back, a place to sleep, there's still not enough for these things. And so you have to kind of compromise on these vital necessities. That's a terrible condition of life. It's very tough to survive. And there's a lot of people living in absolute poverty. So he wrote this paper in 1993. And even then, the number, estimates vary a little bit, but I think a safe number is that upwards of 1 billion. He gives a range of like 500 million to 1.2 billion. Probably about 1 billion people in the year 1993 living in absolute poverty. But think about this, it's now 2021 and the global population is way bigger. So the numbers that he cites in his essay are just larger numbers now. So if there's 1 billion people living in absolute poverty back then, we're definitely closer to 2 billion at this point in time. So anyway, a lot of people in the world live in this total depths of poverty. And he's just trying to impress upon the reader how tough that situation is for people. You're thinking about not having the basic means to provide the food, the nutrition that's needed to sustain your baseline physical and mental health. If you're living that way, you're fighting off starvation. It's not just like I'm really hungry and I need a meal, but you're literally maybe going to starve because you can't attain the means for survival. Not only that, but in parts of the world where absolute poverty prevails, there's poor public health systems, poor public sanitation, low literacy rates. And so not only are you dealing with hunger, but also you're fighting off all kinds of opportunistic diseases, infections, and other forms of pestilence. So it's just a tough deal. It's a tough situation, obviously, to put it lightly or put it mildly. Now, some people, it's hard for them to feel a sense of sympathy for the global poor. Some people might have this reaction. Well, if you're living in a global poverty or absolute poverty, maybe you just haven't worked hard enough or been industrious enough. Maybe you're in a country where policies of the government are so ineffective that reform should happen, and then that would better serve those people. So some people anyway might say that if you're that poor, you could be taking better initiative to upgrade your situation. But it's hard to have those same kind of calloused feelings towards little children that are suffering through extreme and absolute poverty, right? Because little children obviously can't make a decision. Where will I be born? What circumstances will I be born into? You're just born into the world wherever you're born. And if you're living in a part of the world where you're in absolute poverty, how can we not feel at least a little scintilla of sentiment and sympathy for those children? Because, millions of children, the statistic is that it's over 14 million children a year will die just from lack of adequate nutrition, basically starvation. And children are supposed to be the healthiest, with the longest lifespan ahead of them to face. So children starving is not something that ought to be happening. And we in the industrialized first world don't really get to see the full scale of human poverty if we just look in our own communities, in our own cities. Who are the poorest among us in the United States? Well, you guys know that that's the homeless, right? And probably some of you have had at least some experience, with looking at homeless encampments or like a Skid Row type of area, people living in tents. Now, that's certainly a very hard way to live, even in the United States. But the author makes the point that there's levels to poverty. So even the poorest among us in the US, that level of poverty pales in comparison to the extremes of poverty that you would see in parts of the third world. So like with the social programs that we have and the surplus wealth that the citizens have in most cases, even a homeless person in our country can tap into one of those funding sources or even panhandle for money and receive enough on a daily basis to meet their nutritional baseline needs. So you don't usually see people in our homeless environments looking like a skeleton, literally, that is about to die from starvation. But you do see that in like the plains of West Africa and certain parts of the world where, even children can look skeletonized. So he just makes the mention that poverty exists in our country, sure, and in other industrialized first world countries, there's poverty and it's a problem, but it's not at all on the same level or on the par with the kind of poverty and hunger that is found in the third world. So absolute poverty makes people's lives short, it kills, and it makes people miserable. So remember, Peter Singer sees himself as a utilitarian philosopher. That's his moral perspective, utilitarianism. And since we've learned about that, now you know that in utilitarian thought, the right action is just whatever action generates the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So if absolute poverty is making people's lives miserable, painful, short, difficult, then he sees it as perhaps the number one source of human misery in the planet. And so it's like a counterweight to the promotion of human happiness and pleasure, this misery that comes from poverty and hunger. So he says one that is a utilitarian would have every motivation to try and do something to improve on the status quo, because as he sees it from a utilitarian point of view, this is an unacceptable status quo. It's not the happiest it could be due to the suffering and loss that happens with absolute poverty. So what to do? So the next point in his discussion is this. Okay, good. Yeah, so I just want to make sure I'm covering all the points that I wanted to talk about. I'm going to clear the board for a moment. Before I add some more notes, let me just say this. With philosophy, especially when you're just getting into it, studying it for the first time, like a lot of you guys, I know that sometimes it can seem a little weird when you start learning about arguments in philosophy and you read that there's a lot of these hypothetical scenarios. Hypothetical scenarios, a guy's walking through the forest, he sees a spear. Or imagine that there's a greatest conceivable island or something like that. So there's a lot of heavy use of thought experiments and hypotheticals. Sometimes people find that a little off-putting. They're like, well, isn't that a bit removed from reality or from practical things? Me, as a philosopher, of course, I find no fault with that at all. It's like it's important to sometimes be able to consider features of an argument just in a conceptual way by using these examples. But to those that find him a little frustrating, well, at least with Peter Singer's article here, there's nothing hypothetical about what he's talking about. This kind of global poverty that we're mentioning isn't like a made-up idea or just something that we could imagine. It's a real-world fact, and it's there all the time. It's something that doesn't come and go like the weather, okay? Like yesterday, where I live in Long Beach, there was some rain. We had some thunderstorms in the morning. Today, it's nice and sunny again, so the weather changed. But global poverty, absolute hunger, it's not like that. It's not like, we had absolute poverty last week. It cleared up for a while. Now it's going to be back next week or something. No, it's always there. And the only reason that we don't sometimes notice it is simply because we don't attend to it. And it's not really served up to us in our information diet, in our domestic news media. We are preoccupied in our news media with the affairs of our own political happenings here and other issues of interest to Americans like sports, entertainment, celebrity gossip. So don't think, though, he says, that everything's going well in the world just when there's nothing major happening in the United States news media information news cycle, because absolute poverty is always there. If we want to focus our mind on it, it'll always be there for us to see. So the next thing that Peter Singer talks about is this. Some people at this stage of his argument might try to stop him right in his tracks and say, but hold on, Peter Singer. This is an inevitable problem that can't be fixed. Someone might say it's futile to try and solve the problem of global poverty because simply we do not have enough resources for all the people that exist. So someone may say that it's inevitable that some will starve and die from hunger because in a world with too many people and not enough consumable resources, that's a recipe for some people not having as much as they would like or any at all, right? Let me give you a little analogy. Some of you have maybe heard of a game called musical chairs, right? Or you've played it yourself. If you don't know, here's how it goes. People circle a set of chairs and music plays. The thing is, there's not as many chairs as there are people. So once the music stops, everyone tries to sit down, but because there's more people than chairs, someone doesn't get a seat, and then they're out of the game. Well, as an analogy, in the world, you could say there's a certain amount of food, but there's so many people, more than what the food could possibly provide for. So if you have too many people, not enough food, some people won't get the food that they would like or need for their health, well-being, and survival. But Peter Singer says to this idea, no, I don't agree. He says it's not a problem of scarcity, actually. So it's not that there's no conceivable way to get enough consumable resources for all the people that are hungry. Instead, he says the problem of global hunger is a problem of the poor distribution and waste of available resources. So let me write the point here on the board, and then we'll have a little more discussion of it. So here's the current claim by Peter Singer. The problem of global hunger is not a problem, he says, of scarcity of resources, instead, he says it is actually it is a problem of two things: poor distribution and waste of available resources. So this is his current claim. Not a problem of scarcity, is a problem of poor distribution and waste. So here's why he says this. As I said before, the claim could be made in objection to his view that we should do something about this. Someone could say nothing can be done. It's an impossible problem to solve. Too many people, not enough food, so that's scarcity of resources, and therefore, without enough resources, we can't fix the problem. But he says it's not true. In fact, here's the real issue. It's simply because of the way we distribute the available resources and the way that we waste them. So he gives this. He mentions these things for two basic reasons. Okay, so on the one hand, he says that in the West, we have this heavy emphasis on animal agriculture and the central role of meat in the Western diet. We have like a pretty heavily carnivorous, meat-based diet in the West, and there's a heavy demand for like large amounts of cheap animal products, meat and so forth. Well, a lot of research exists to show that this actually produces huge inefficiency in the amount of consumable resources that we can provide for human beings, because you have to divert a lot of energy and consumable resources to livestock, cattle, chickens, and so on to bring them up to market production for consumption. And that same amount of consumable resources and energy that is given to the livestock, cattle, and other animals could more efficiently be given directly to human beings and would feed a much larger number of people than if we divert them first to animals and convert the animals into meat for people to eat. So it has been said that if there was a change in consumer habits individually and socially to reduce the role of factory farming in our agricultural processes, that would generate so much additional consumable resources that it could therefore feed an even larger global population than what we have now of over 6 billion people. So he's saying this, and I mean, it might not sound like too surprising to you since I already mentioned that he's the author of Animal Liberation, but he's not necessarily saying this because he thinks, well, everyone will make a mass movement and a conversion to vegetarianism and save the problem of global hunger basically by doing that, because he knows that's not realistic. But he wants to point it out just so that he can make the reader aware that it's not theoretically inconceivable for us as individuals or societies to at least make some changes to our basic consumer habits or practices that would at least make an improvement or a dent in the problem of global hunger. So he doesn't want to like concede the point or let us off the hook, as it were, excusing inaction by saying this is a completely impossible problem to solve. There are ways that we could make improvements on the situation, and we're choosing not to do that. And then second, there's waste. In the Western world, a lot of food that we buy and purchase goes straight to the landfill. Sometimes that's because if you go and you eat out, you order more than what you think you can eat. Well, I don't know if it's more than you think you can eat. People say you have eyes bigger than your stomach sometimes. And in the West, when we have such surplus wealth and we like to just try out a lot of different tastes and foods, we're sometimes not the most frugal or efficient in the way that we purchase versus what we end up consuming. So a lot of stuff will go into the trash can because you left it on the table. In other cases, you fill your pantry with a bunch of food, and then sometimes you have to throw it out because it's going to spoil. So we here in the West actually waste tons of food every day, whereas there's people in other parts of the world that don't even have enough to eat to survive. So if these two things were changed in some ways, like we didn't eat as much meat basically and we wasted less food, that would have huge impact on improving the situation of global poverty. So he returns to his main theme that we should do something about this, change some aspects of the way we live to make an improvement on the situation, and not just in our consumer habits, but on the diversion of resources from the first world to the third world. A transfer of wealth could help improve on the problem so that they would have greater ability to farm and secure their own resources for food. Now, we talked about poverty. The other side of the coin is affluence. And so now he wants to just mention a few facts about how it is to live in a wealthy country. So all of us, according to the way he defines this term, are members of this category, absolute affluence. So we talked about absolute poverty. Now we learn about absolute affluence. So absolute affluence is just the flip side of absolute poverty. This is having more than enough income or wealth to meet those same basic needs that I mentioned: food, clothing, and shelter. Okay, having more than enough of that income and wealth to meet the same basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. So basically, according to this idea, all of us are absolutely affluent. Now, I know you might not necessarily, some of us wake up in the morning and think, I'm rich, I'm affluent. But we're talking about this in relative terms. So compare yourself to a person who all their money, all their work and effort goes just towards the basic necessities of life. We are living in a different way. After we have spent our income and wealth to secure the basic necessities, each one of us has money left over to spend on any number of non-essential things that are just wants rather than needs. And I'm no exception to that. Like, for example, after there's food in my fridge, pay my rent, clothes that I'm wearing, I still have money left over to spend on all kinds of random stuff that I just feel like having just for fun. Like, I don't know, this watch that I'm wearing, it's like $1,000 watch, but I run all the time. There's all kinds of technology in here that tracks my heart rate and my pulse oximeter and GPS. So did I need that? Not necessarily. It's not necessarily something I need to survive. But with the surplus wealth, that's something I wanted to purchase. Or big flat screen TV or PlayStation 5. I want to get that this summer. But that's not necessarily something that's necessary for survival either. And it's not just me, but it's all of us. So whether it's you buying a new outfit, new pair of shoes just because you think they look cool, or it used to be things like concert tickets, movies, vacations. I know some of that stuff is on hold for the moment. But you all understand, right, that we in the first world, we don't have only the money necessary for baseline survival, but more and over beyond that. So he wonders, why couldn't we at least transfer some of the surplus wealth that we would otherwise spend on non-essential desires for ourselves and divert some of that to the cause of third world global poverty? If we did that, he says, we could really improve on their case, and it wouldn't really undermine or threaten our own basic welfare or well-being to any significant degree. And he reminds us again of the contrast between the haves and the have-nots, the absolute poor versus those that are in absolute affluence. We're talking about people in absolute poverty living on an average per capita income of $200 US dollars. Now, let me clarify that. This paper was written in 1993, so the figure that he gives, $200 US dollars, given the rates of inflation over the last 28 years or so, this number is easily probably double by now. But still, that's a tiny amount. Imagine that your budget for the whole year is $400 US dollars. That's like a little more than $1 per day. And how hard would it be for you to survive on that? It'd be very, very difficult. Now, we're not talking about how much purchasing power $1 US dollar would have at the rates of exchange if you converted it into a foreign currency and spent it there, because in some cases, the US dollar is quite strong compared against foreign currency, and it has more purchasing power than it does here. So like, I've been to India a few times, China and stuff too, and take the case of India. When I go there and I exchange a US dollar at the Travelex, it's equal to like 60 rupees in Indian currency. And you can buy like street food in many cases for like 10 rupees and stuff. So the dollar actually is quite powerful there. You can feel very rich even traveling with a small amount of money. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about how much purchasing power the US dollar has in our monetary system. So imagine that you were limited to a budget of $400 for the whole year. What would you do? Well, you'd have to do what people in the third world actually do, which is band together in like big communal living situations, oftentimes extended families, where everyone pools together the meager income that they can offer, and then large surplus amounts of food that can be rationed off over a long stretch of time are purchased for everyone's survival, like grain, legumes, and things like that. So anyway, it's just a very hard way to live. Now, how much money really is being transferred from the first world to the third world? That's his next point of discussion. Well, he says here again, it's kind of a disappointing story to tell. The United Nations in 1993 had this as the target figure of donation from the first world nations to the third world for the sake of poverty reduction and global hunger reduction. The United Nations said, can you guys give 0.7 of 1%, 0.7 of 1% of GDP? So the gross domestic product, the annual economic output of the country, is GDP. And they were saying, can you divert a measly 0.7 of 1% of your gross domestic product to the cause of global poverty relief? And that would make a big impact. Well, even that modest and achievable goal wasn't quite met. So just another example of how he thinks we're deficient in our moral obligation here. Let me write the numbers because they're written down in the book. Just trying to get to it. Yeah, so he says at present very little is being transferred. Only Sweden, Netherlands, Norway, and some of the oil exporting Arab states have reached that target of 0.7. But in the time he wrote this, how did other Western nations measure up? Well, the UK, Britain, 0.31%, so that's less than half. Germany, a little better at 0.41%, but still short by a significant margin. Japan, one of the major economies in the world, but still 0.32%. And finally, wait for it, the United States, with all our magnificent wealth, the wealthiest country at the top of the whole pyramid of wealth. Not the most generous, at least in this one case, 0.15%. So he says, looking at these facts, we have to ask some tough questions. And here's his moral question that he thinks is worth asking. If we could give more aid, which would have saved lives through the provision of such aid, but we withhold on giving it, does this place us anywhere on a moral par with those who kill? Because if you kill, you commit an act which directly causes death, obviously, by definition. But you could argue that when you withhold on aid or assistance, when you fail to assist, but the assistance would have prevented death, then the withholding on aid could have the same effect as killing would. You know, like if you saw somebody drowning and you could easily just pick them up and grab them and get them out of that body of water, and you refuse to do it, is this different from putting the person in the water and trying to kill them? Well, okay. Having said that, I want us to walk back from the brink just for a bit, because I understand, and probably many of you would agree, that even if it's a good thing to give to the poor, can you really call somebody somehow parallel to a killer if they don't give such aid? I'm sure you and I and many of the rest of us would hesitate to accept that comparison. Like you'd resist any comparison between your moral character and that of an actual killer, because some of us, of course, don't give to charity or donate. So there has to be a difference, basically, between killing and failing to assist, one thinks. But what is the difference? So that's our next topic to analyze. What Peter Singer walks us through next is what one might say are the differences between killing and failing to assist. And so let me explain why he goes over this. He's aware that a critic, an opponent of his argument, is going to step in now and say, whatever you're saying about comparing killing and failing to assist is off base because they're not the same, they're different. He knows people will raise these points, and so he's himself going to try and articulate those statements only so that he can go back through them and show that there still is something wrong with the failure to assist. So overall, he's ultimately going to kind of concede one point. He's going to concede that, yes, okay, killing is worse. It is worse by comparison than the failure to give aid. But he's going to still hold his ground that even if it's worse to kill than to fail to assist, that does not totally excuse the failure to assist from all moral blame. It's still blameworthy, it's still wrong, even if killing, to be fair, is even worse. So a good philosopher and just a thorough debater is always going to try and imagine what their opponent will say so that they can formulate a rebuttal. If you're in a courtroom and you're like the prosecutor or the defense, you might say to the jury before the other side presents their arguments, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution is going to tell you that my client did this in cold blood and that they were obviously the person who did it, because you're gonna hear testimony from blah 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 accusers. But I'm here to tell you that although they're going to say that, the testimony that they're offering you is defective for these reasons. So in that example that I'm just mentioning in passing, one lawyer says to the jury, here's what they're going to say, and I'm going to try and like pre-buttal their arguments, before they even give them. So Peter Singer is kind of like that. He says, to those that disagree with my argument in favor of international assistance, they will now say these are the differences between killing and failing to assist. He'll report on those so-called differences, and then afterward he'll try and go back into them to explain to any reader why he still thinks that there's something wrong with failing to assist. So here we'll create a header for the notes in the next part of what we're talking about. And what it will say here is differences between killing and failing to assist. Okay, so he lists 5 of these claimed differences between killing and failing to assist. So let's go through each one and have some discussion. The first one is this, that the motivation is different. So difference of motivation. Difference of motivation, guys. So let's consider these two examples. Take the case of like a mass shooter, okay? It's a sad thing, but there's really people that have done that, and people who do that. So take the case of a killer who's a mass shooter. What's that person's motive? What is that person trying to accomplish or do? Well, it's pretty clear, and it's very evil. The person wants to cause death. The person wants to be the reason people have died, okay? They want to be the person who took actions which ended human life. So that's the motivation of the killer, to kill, to end life, to harm. And that's evil, sadistic, malicious. That's a very bad motive. Let's compare and contrast that motive with those motives we have when we fail to assist. So suppose that you or I go to the mall or go to a nice restaurant and just blow some cash on something nice for ourselves that we want, that we don't necessarily need, but we think it's fun, entertaining, or whatever. What is your or my motive when we, let's say, sit at the table of the fancy restaurant or in the boutique of a nice shop and buy something there, or buy a nice new fit or whatever, some cool sneakers? What's the motive in that case? Is it to hurt people? Is it to neglect those that need things and be somehow indirectly responsible for their death? Is it the same motive as the killer? If not, tell me what is the motive then? It's just to treat yourself. That's right, Kobe. So it's not done out of malice. It's not done out of hatred or murderous intent. It's simply done out of the pursuit of happiness and pleasure for yourself. So there's a clear different motive, right? It's not like you're sitting there as you check out from the shop where you're buying some item and you're like, haha, sticking it to the poor again. That's really what got me out of bed to come to the mall today, thinking about all the poor people who don't get my money. That's the joy that I get when I spend it. No, you're not thinking about how the money that you could have given to the poor has been denied from them and therefore some may die or starve. You're just thinking about the item that you want and the expense that is involved in getting it. So there's not the same motive. That's a clear difference. The motivation of the killer is to hurt people and kill them. But the motivation that we have as we fail to assist and rather spend on ourselves is not at all a desire for harm of anybody, but rather a pursuit of personal happiness. So there's one difference of motive. A second difference is this, and it's every time I teach this one, it's almost, I don't know if I have a dark sense of humor, but it's almost, there's a little humor in it. Anyway, let's say it. It is not hard to avoid killing people, but it's very hard to save all the lives that you could through assistance. So that's the next one. Okay, so second difference that's claimed here. So like, let's just walk you through the analysis of this point. I'm going to make a little assumption about everybody in this class. I think I'm not, that's probably a safe assumption, but anyway, let me go out on a limb and just assume that none of you guys have ever killed any human being so far in your life. Hopefully you never do. So pretend you've never killed a person. Then you can probably relate to my question here. If you've never killed a person, tell me, has it been hard for you to not kill people so far? Do you constantly have to repress homicidal intentions and desires? And do you struggle with the choice to not kill? I would hope not, right? Is it hard to not kill people? No. What do you have to do to not kill people? Well, you have to just literally do nothing at all. Just right now, sitting there, minding your own business, leaving people alone, that's all you have to do to not kill people. It doesn't require you to even lift a finger. It requires you to not do anything. Okay, so not killing people is the easiest thing in the world. I don't think many of us have found it difficult to get to this point in life without killing anybody. And, you know, it doesn't require that you even lift a finger. Right now, you're not killing billions of people. You're not killing all of them. So it's so easy to not kill. You literally don't have to do anything. Just mind your own business. Leave people alone. Let them live their life. On the other hand, though, what does it take for a person to give assistance that would save lives? Does that require that you just mind your own business and not interfere with people? No. So to help people requires action. It requires time, effort, money, maybe over a long stretch. So that's not doing nothing. That's doing something, and a lot of somethings. So we could argue this. These two things can't be compared, killing and failing to assist, because the obligation that I'm being asked to uphold in the two cases is not the same level of difficulty. Tell me I'm not supposed to kill. Easy, done, no problem. Tell me I am supposed to give aid and assistance to save lives, not so easy. I have to actually do stuff for that to happen. You could argue they're not on a par, they're not parallel, because the moral obligation to not kill is a matter of inaction. But the moral obligation to aid and assist and save lives by means of that is a requirement that we do things, and a lot of things, perhaps over a long stretch of time. So we can't say that they're the same in another case, because not abridging this obligation is easy, but living up to this one is, I don't know. I feel like I would feel a little more comfortable if some of you had said and confirmed for me that it's very easy to not kill people, but I would say it is to not kill people. Okay. As long as you just don't kill people. Good. No, just kidding. Okay, so anyway, let's continue to the next one. Number 3. Difference of certainty of the outcome. Okay, so difference of certainty of the outcome. Here's another interesting point to raise. So he gives the case of the shooter again, so I'm just going to use his own example, Peter Singer. Take the case of a shooter, and this is actually, this one's a little, to me, it's kind of disturbing to think about, but you just, you got to face reality, I guess. Think about this question, okay? Suppose that somebody had the motivation to kill, like a shooter does sometimes, and they had the means to do it, meaning that they had a high-powered weapon, and they had the full intent and the will to use it to hurt a lot of people in a public place. Okay? Suppose someone has that intention and that type of means. What do you think would be the probability or percentage chance that when they take an action based on that they're actually going to kill people or hurt them? Like, what likelihood do you think that they will be able to succeed in their goal of hurting people or killing them? Well, it's a sad thing to say, but I would say it's very close to 100% likelihood. And that's just because the nature of these weapons, the element of surprise, the fact that these people could just plot and, determine the ideal time, setting, and et cetera, for their act, it makes it very, very likely, which is really sad, isn't it? It means that kind of all of us are like living at the mercy of these psychopaths. Like, are they going to let me survive today? Or are they just going to decide to kill me? Because if they wanted to, then they, I'd be gone already. I have a public schedule, so do a lot of people. So, it's too bad that that's the case. But anyway, I digress. The point is that it is very certain, isn't it, that if a person has the means and motive to kill with that kind of weapon, then with a high degree of likelihood, people are going to be hurt. Because again, the element of surprise is there. When someone starts shooting, they don't announce, hey guys, 5 minutes from now I'm going to start. They just start shooting. And by that time, everyone's already at a loss because they had no ability to anticipate it. So it's not like the Old West where everyone's got guns drawn on their holster and one guy who shoots is going to immediately be neutralized. So anyway, it's a high likelihood that the shooter will kill, or someone who's plotted to kill is going to kill. But let's take the other case. Say that you failed to assist, right? You had an opportunity to give aid to charity of some kind, but you just bypassed that choice and didn't do it. Okay, well, can you really say that it's totally certain that the withholding on aid is going to lead to anyone's material harm or death? It's not as certain, at least. There's always a little room for doubt and skepticism about the effectiveness of the aid organization itself. So you could say this: I was thinking of giving money, but I bet you even if I had given it, it might not have helped anybody. Maybe they would have wasted the money that I donated on administrative costs or overhead costs. Or maybe they would have diverted it into a project that looks good on paper but didn't end up helping anyone. Like they build a well in a village somewhere in the third world, but this is a village that has since been evacuated by refugees, and so no one's actually using it. So there's room for doubt about whether or not the money that you could have given would have really saved any lives. Probably it might have, but you can always be skeptical or doubtful of that. So there's a little less certainty that the withholding on aid is going to really lead to any harm, as opposed to the case of one setting out to kill. That's almost certainly going to lead to harm. So you can say, here's another main difference. How certain is it that either setting forth to kill or failing to assist is going to lead to real harm? This is almost certainly going to lead to harm. This, not as clear. Okay, so 3 differences there. And there's 2 more that he mentions. So let's get into the last 2. There's fourth, identifiability of the victim. So that's another difference. So we're still on the same topic. I just erased the header to create space. But another difference between killing and failing to assist is in terms of the identifiability of the victim. So to a killer, to a shooter, there are clear victims. And when a shooter shoots and kills people that way, no one can deny that those people are dead specifically because of the actions taken by the shooter. By definition, if you're the shooter, you shot people, now they're dead, whose fault is it? Definitely the shooter, okay? And it's easy and clear to identify who those victims are. You know, these are people with names, identities, and it's easily connected directly to the perpetrator's actions. But let's take another case. Say that you or I fail to assist, don't give money or aid to any organization that could provide aid. Well, is there any specific individual in the whole planet Earth who we can say, hey, you, specifically you, the student watching this, it's because you declined to aid that so-and-so died on that particular date and time. There's no way to draw a direct line between one person withholding on aid and another specific named individual dying somewhere because they didn't have enough food on that day. So like every day people are starving. And if you or I don't give money to some source of humanitarian assistance today, surely there are going to be some people of all different ages that'll die today, tomorrow, but we can't necessarily, well, we can't at all connect or link a specific individual's death to one randomly chosen citizen's withholding on aid. So that's another difference. You can say to those who go out and kill, we know who the victims are and it's their direct responsibility. But for those who withhold on aid, there's no possible mechanism by which we could say, here are particular people who have been harmed through the withholding of aid by one individual. So that's another main difference. The identity of victims cannot be claimed as clearly associated with one randomly chosen withholding of assistance. Sometimes you see these commercials and stuff that try to compel you, you know, for the cost of a cup of coffee, you could be saving this little child's life. And they'll show you like a sad image of a person who lives in the third world. But the aid agencies don't even really work that way anyway. The money goes into a pool of funding, which is then administered according to the priorities of the aid agency. So it's not like necessarily earmarked for a specific person unless that's a feature, a special feature of one aid agency's distribution method. So anyway, long story short, a killer produces clear victims and their identities are obviously associated with actions of the shooter or killer. But that's not the same when one withholds on aid. Okay, and then the one last difference between killing and failing to assist is this one, okay, that when it comes to the failure to assist and the fact that there are poor people starving out there, you can always say of them, well, it's not my fault that they are poor. So that's something that one can say. You can always say it's not my fault they're poor. That they are poor. So you could say that about the fact that there's poor people in the third world, but you could never say that if you had shot and killed people. You can't kill people and then say, hey, it's not my fault that they've got shot. I mean, that's totally illogical. Of course, if you had done so, then it would be your fault specifically. But when it comes to the poor people starving in absolute poverty, you could say, okay, well, look, I'm responsible for taking accountability for problems that I cause. So if I shoot somebody, then it's fair to hold me accountable, prosecute me, throw me in jail, whatever. But I can't be held accountable for problems which I myself didn't cause, which already were there, you know, before I was even born. So you could say I was born into this world, and the poor people of the third world were already there. It's not like I had something to do with the fact that they're there. So don't burden me with an obligation to assist the poor, since it's not a problem that I have any direct connection to. Let me ask you to think of a trippy little scenario, okay? Not too bad, but something strange. Imagine that this world that we are in, that you were never born, okay? You were born. I'm very happy that you were, and I'm happy to meet you. But suppose that you never had been born. Like your parents basically back then, they never met each other. So this class is happening, but you're just not in it, okay? Well, suppose that. If you hadn't been born, question, do you think that the third world poor would still exist? And I mean, that's an obvious question. It's a rhetorical question. Of course they would still exist. It's not as if when you were born, global poverty just popped out of nowhere and it's all because you happen to exist. Clearly there was global poverty before you and it'll be there after you. So you could say, how can I be morally responsible for fixing this problem, which in effect would exist whether or not I was ever born? If my whole existence makes no difference one way or the other to the fact that this problem is out there, then maybe one would say I don't have any obligation to do anything about it. And that's why it's different from killing, because when one kills, they're certainly responsible for the harm that was caused. But when there's an ongoing, harmful situation that you're not at fault for causing, you might decline to take any responsibility to rectify it. Okay, so we got these differences between killing and failing to assist, but don't lose the plot, because remember, Peter Singer says we do have an obligation to assist the global poor. So his next move is this. He's going to try to report back on these differences to show the reader why he thinks that despite killing being worse, okay, and maybe these points can show us that it is worse, still though, the failure to assist is wrong, and it doesn't just become okay just because something else is even worse than it, which is what killing would be. So now we go into Peter Singer's explanation of why these 5 so-called differences do not ultimately justify the refusal to aid the poor in the third world. Okay, so first of all, I'll just talk about this one, identifiability of the victim. He says that's not really a morally relevant difference. And now he does give us like a funny thought experiment to try and make the point about, okay? Now I'm going to try and work with his example, and then maybe I'll offer you like an alternative example that makes the same point. But first of all, here's what Peter Singer says. So it's a kind of weird case, but imagine this. There's a guy who sells a product that's consumable. Okay, so he's like the owner of a business which sells a consumable product. Now, he profits off the sale of it, but the problem is that it contains a chemical which, when you ingest it, it will double the risk that you could get stomach cancer down the line. Okay? Now, it doesn't guarantee that anybody will get stomach cancer, but it doubles the risk, this chemical that's present in the product that they sell. But the person sells it anyway. Kind of like, cigarette manufacturers sell a product which is known to have deadly properties and stuff, but it's profitable. So anyway, he sells this anyway. Now, suppose that time passes and one customer who bought this product and consumed it comes down with stomach cancer years later. And then they come back to the vendor with a complaint. Hey, I bought your product, and doing my research, it shows that it contains this chemical which doubles the risk of stomach cancer. So you're at fault, sir, because you sold this thing to me knowing that it had this dangerous property in it. And you're morally at fault for that. You really should find fault, and you should, be guilty about what you've done. Now, what could this salesperson try to say to partially absolve themselves of moral blame? Well, what they might try to say is, I'm sorry you have stomach cancer. Yes, my product had a chemical in it that could double the chance. But we don't know for sure that you got stomach cancer from me, though. All my product does is what? It doubles the chance, the odds. But it's possible that you still got it from somewhere else. It might be a false positive indicator that you ever took my product. And the real reason you have stomach cancer today is something genetic or some other environmental exposure to like a pathogenic thing in the environment. So we can't guarantee that you're a victim of my product. Therefore, I take no responsibility. Well, the point the author is making is that even if we can't precisely prove that this is his victim, doesn't he still bear a measure of responsibility because he knowingly increased the risk to this person by selling them the product with this chemical in it? So, by comparison, in third world global poverty, if you were to give assistance, like aid money, that could help reduce the risk that certain unknown individuals out there would come to harm through starvation. And so, declining to provide such aid, maybe we can never point out one particular person and say with any kind of credible certainty, this person died because you specifically failed to give aid. But you still add to the joint pool of risk by declining to offer such aid. And therefore, on a par with our salesperson, you're still at fault to some degree. So another case I can think of is this. Suppose someone, they go around in public places with no mask, and maybe this person is like interact with people with no mask, and they later on, they find out that they had COVID. And then someone that they were dealing with when they didn't have this mask on comes down with COVID also, right? And then they come back to the person complaining like, you know what, you're running around with no mask, and then later on we found out that you were positive. I'm holding you responsible or blaming you because I was hanging out with you at that time, and now I've got COVID myself. Now, the person could say, well, who knows for a fact that you got it from me? I mean, it's possible, and I made it more likely because I took this behavior that increased risk to you, but we don't know for a fact that the risk that you ended up realizing was due to my exposure or something else out there. Does this mean that the person can be excused from all blame because we can't identify precisely the extent to which his action caused harm? No. So again, another way of looking at the same kind of example that's maybe more relatable, I guess, in the current time than the one the author used. Okay, so he says with identifiability of the victim, it does not remove all the blame for the reasons mentioned there. Okay, what about the certainty of the outcome? Certainty of the outcome. Okay, so for this certainty of the outcome case or difference, he mentions an example that I think is quite good, and it's the case of the drunk driver versus, let's say, a homicidal driver. Okay, so tale of two drivers. Suppose that one driver is homicidal. They get behind the wheel with the full intention to use the wheel as a murder weapon to strike people and hopefully kill them with the car. So like that unfortunately has happened. There have been some terrorist attacks like in France and Germany involving the use of a motor vehicle to plow into big crowds. It has also happened even closer to home. A person that was kind of mentally ill did it at the Venice Beach boardwalk, and it happened in Santa Monica farmers market a couple of years before that. So anyway, this is something that really can happen, but I'm giving it to you as a hypothetical. So take the case of one murderous person getting behind the wheel with the full intention to strike as many people and kill them with the car as they can. Compare that to another case of a drunk driver. A drunk driver who has no desire to hit anybody, but is driving too drunk and therefore is not safe behind the wheel. Now I have a question. Which one of those two people is likelier to cause death and injury? The homicidal driver or the drunk driver? That's the question. What's more certain to produce a deadly outcome? You have two options, and I think it's a clearer case. So you can just tell me. Yeah, what is it? It's the homicidal one, right, Kobe? Because if that person hits and kills people, it won't be an accident, it won't be inadvertent. It's exactly what they're intending to do. So they're going to try and skillfully manipulate the car towards that outcome. So this is even likelier to cause harm, but now we get to the real point. Does this mean that the drunk driver's done nothing wrong? Because when the drunk driver drives, it's not as certain to cause death and injury as if a person was trying to hurt people with the car. Does that remove all the blame from the drunk driver, or is he still at fault? He's still morally to blame, isn't he? He still deserves blame. We can't say, hey, don't tell me I did something wrong, because at least I'm not trying to hit people. Obviously, it's still wrong, and why? It's still wrong because it raises the degree of risk that some people will be injured or hurt by his car while he's driving it. So even if it's not as certain, as in the case where you're trying to hurt people, it still adds exposure of risk, and on that basis, it's wrong enough. Okay, so like those that kill, they're very certainly going to cause death as an outcome. But those that withhold on aid, you could argue, knowingly add additional degree of risk to those that would otherwise have possibly survived or benefited from the aid. So even if it's not quite as certain that the withholding on aid would hurt anybody, the fact that it adds risk in the first place of some measure does make it wrong to some degree nonetheless. And Kobe, you say, no, they should still be held accountable because they increase the chances, and that's exactly right, yes. Okay, so much for that point. To the next thing he talks about, he goes into this point that you can always say it's not my fault that they're poor. You always say that. Well, he says a couple of things about that. His first way of pushing back is to straight up say, are you sure it's not our fault in some indirect, like historical sense? Because here's what he means. Some people argue with, it's a credible argument, I guess. There's some reasons to see the world this way, but some people think that the economic haves and have-nots that we see in international community, like some countries are very wealthy like ours and some are very poor in the third world. Some people attribute the origins of this inequity to a colonial system of economic exploitation that preceded our current day, like colonialism, taking resources, using war, plunder, guns, germs, and steel to like dominate and control a lot of these economies that we had the means to do that with, European settlers and all of that stuff. So you could argue that if we are those who continue to benefit from the ill-gotten gains of like colonialism past, then maybe we do have some kind of indirect responsibility to redress the wrongs that are still being experienced because of those earlier historical injustices. On the other hand, though, he knows that some people will deny any even indirect responsibility for the current status quo. You know, like people will say, don't impose the sins of the father upon the son. And so a lot of people might have that way of looking at this discussion, that even if some of our ancestors committed acts that divested wealth from the third world and gave it to the first world, we today are a new generation and we can't necessarily be held accountable for those historical misdeeds. Well, he says, if that's the way you feel, then he has a second line of reply to this. So either it is in some indirect way our fault, or if it isn't, he says, well, just be a utilitarian then. And if you're a utilitarian, then what do you think is your always standing moral obligation? To take the action that leads to the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. It doesn't say, make the situation better and more happy, but only if you caused the problem in the first place. So like in the utilitarian way of thinking, if you saw a house on fire and all you had to do was like use a broomstick to poke open the door so that the people could come running out to safety, no utilitarian would be able to say this, well, I did not set the house on fire. I'm not the arsonist. So these people, just let them deal with it on their own. I'm only going to, take action if I cause the problem to begin with. No, in utilitarian thought, if you're present on the scene, no matter what's the cause of the fire, if you're able to help put it out or save people, and it's at no significant cost to you, then that's what you ought to do, because declining to do that creates less total happiness. So in a way, he has these two replies to the following point here. He says, well, in one way of looking at it, we can't necessarily deny some indirect responsibility, or at least some of us can't deny some indirect responsibility for the current international status quo. But if you deny that, well, fine, then just be a utilitarian. And if that's the case, giving aid to international humanitarian organizations and stuff is optimistic. It creates more total happiness than withholding on it. So either way you go, he says, we still have this obligation. Okay, now 2 more points. Different motivation. Again, we can use this homicidal versus drunk driver example to explain that one and why it doesn't remove all the blame from those that fail to assist. So what's the motive of the homicidal driver? I think we went over that. They're trying to hit and kill people with the car, so they have a desire to kill. What's the motivation of the drunk driver? It's not to hurt anybody. In fact, to the contrary, if you're a drunk driver, I mean, you don't want to be discovered as a drunk driver, so you don't want to get in an accident, which would then invite all kinds of legal liability upon you. But the motivation of the drunk driver is not the same evil and sadistic, malicious motive of the homicidal driver. It's a motive of self-interest, I guess. They don't want to have to ask for a ride or call like a ride service or stay at the place where they are at overnight or something. So in their own mind, it's out of convenience or desire or pleasure that they, take the drunk drive. But does that mean that because the drunk driver doesn't have the same evil motive as the killer driver, that means he's done nothing wrong? No, it's still wrong, even if his motive is not malicious. So in the same way, when you withhold on aid, certainly you're not motivated in the way a killer is. It's not like you're trying to go to the third world and shoot at poor people when you withhold on aid. So it's not the same kind of motive, but you could argue that in withholding on it, you still knowingly increase risk to some unknown individuals, like the drunk driver would do. And so even without an evil or sadistic motive, you could be described as doing something that's morally wrong. And then finally, this thing, that it's not hard to avoid killing, but it is very tough to save all the lives that you possibly could save through assistance. With this, Peter Singer just kind of makes short work of it, and he says, well, that's not really what I've argued anyway. He says, I'm not arguing that you should spend every waking hour and all of your extra money in a nonstop, never-ending effort to provide help for the third world poor. Of course, that would be overly burdensome, and that would be unreasonable for any person to live up to. But he does say that it's not too much to ask for us to do more than absolutely nothing, just more than zero. And if that is the standard that we are being held accountable to, then it doesn't seem, he thinks, so hard for us to live up to that minimal standard of just doing something rather than nothing. So having reported back on all these claimed differences between killing and failing to assist, the author returns to his affirmative argument that we do have an obligation to assist. And that's written on page 145 actually. And the full argument that he's kind of been building towards is finally stated on page 145. So I'm going to write it here, and we'll try to explain a little bit of it. So the full argument that he fleshes out now, let's call the obligation to assist argument. This is Peter Singer's famous obligation to assist argument. Okay, so it's an argument with three premises that then lead to the conclusion below. The first premise says this: if we're able to prevent something bad from happening, if we're able to prevent a bad thing without making a comparable sacrifice, then we should prevent it. So here we go. If we can prevent a bad thing without making a comparable sacrifice, that's an important little clause, then in that case we should prevent that bad thing. Okay, and then from there the rest of the argument is pretty straightforward. The second premise just says absolute poverty is a bad thing. The third premise, going from there, just says, by the way, we can prevent some of this absolute poverty without making a comparable sacrifice. Without making a comparable sacrifice. So can you deduce the conclusion? I think hopefully it's pretty elementary now that we see all three premises. Sacrifice. That's the end of the third premise. And then because we're now stating the conclusion, we have this horizontal line and the conclusion's below. So what do you think would be the conclusion if you can just read the argument through? It's an if-then here. If what? If we can prevent a bad thing without making a comparable sacrifice, then in that case we should do that. And absolute poverty is bad. And next statement, we can prevent some without making a comparable sacrifice. So therefore, any deduction? What do you deduce? There's a clear conclusion that follows from the three statements. Maybe you have a thought about it, and if so, let's see it. Yes, so let me know. Conclusion of the argument? Sometimes it's good for you to deduce these conclusions, because if you just sort of write them down and you're not thinking through the argument, then it's less memorable. That's what I've noticed. So to make it more memorable for you, let's see if a student can maybe try to take a stab at this conclusion. It's not too tough, but what do you think it would be? If we can prevent something bad without making a major sacrifice, we should. And this is bad, and we can prevent some. So therefore, we have an obligation to assist, right? Therefore, just stating it as the consequent of this conditional, therefore, we should prevent some absolute poverty. I'm just going to abbreviate here AP, and you know that stands for absolute poverty. Okay, so good. That's right, good Kobe also. So let me then go through the argument one more time and show you how he defends each premise. So it is a valid argument. It's a case of modus ponens, basically, which is a valid form of deductive syllogism. And that means that since it's valid, the only way you can disagree with this conclusion is if you find fault with some premise, because if all three premises are conceded as true, then the conclusion must be true logically. So if someone doesn't like this conclusion, they have to find one premise at least to reject. But Peter Singer thinks each premise is kind of bulletproof. It's hard to find reason to find fault with any of them. Let's go through his argument why. Premise one, if you can prevent a bad thing without making a comparable sacrifice, then you should. All that's saying is that in case something's really bad and you can make it not happen, you can prevent it. And the thing you have to do to prevent it is not a sacrifice that compares to the level of harm that the wrong thing is that you're trying to prevent. So if what you have to do to stop this bad thing is not on the same level as the bad thing itself, then you should go ahead and prevent it. An example that he gives to illustrate this is a famous example of Peter Singer. It's the drowning child scenario. So like, I'm just gonna write that here. Example given, drowning child scenario. So here, let me just try to speak on this drowning child case. I say it's a hypothetical, but it's kind of funny actually, true story. The exact scenario played out like almost exactly how Peter Singer described it hypothetically in a real world case a couple years ago. And so like, philosophers and stuff that I know on social media were circulating this article in The Guardian about how an event just like this actually happened. So, I mean, I'm giving it to you as a hypothetical, but clearly it's something that could happen and it actually has. Anyway, suppose that you're walking around just taking a walk and you see a little child that is in a body of water, like a shallow pond, and they're not good at swimming, they're by themselves, and they're in a panic and they're afraid because they're drowning at that time. Now suppose that you're the only person present on the scene that anyone could see around. So it's really on you basically to save this child's life by reaching your hand out there and pulling them up out of the water so that they don't drown to death. If you don't do it, no one else will be able to do it and the child will die. So here's the question. Do you think you're obligated to reach over and prevent this child's death? Now plug it into this premise. What's the bad thing that one could prevent in this example? The death of the child. The child dying is bad, but it could be prevented with your aid. What's the sacrifice that you have to make in my example to prevent this death? Well, in the first way I've described it, there's almost no sacrifice. It's just the momentary attention to the child's need, the little bit of exertion and the extent of one's arm, and pulling them up out of the water. So is that such a big sacrifice? Not really. So in this case, you could prevent something very bad, the death of a child, without making anything that's a major sacrifice, and so therefore you should. Let me change the case just a little bit. Suppose that you're seeing the same scenario, you're seeing this child drowning in the body of water, and you're the only one around. But in this case, let's suppose you're wearing like the nicest outfit, like you're wearing like really nice fit that you spent a lot of money on. This is like expensive, rare clothing, and you don't want to mess these clothes up. But in this case, let's imagine that for you to get to the child, you actually have to wade into this water a little bit. There's no threat to you of drowning or anything, because for you, it's a shallow body of water compared to a little kid. But you would have to ruin those clothes. So you're going to have to wade into the murky, muddy water, and this whole fit is going to be just thrown in the trash after that. So do you think you still have the moral obligation, everybody, in that case? Well, I know we're running low on time, so I don't want to take a lot of time waiting for your reaction, but I would hope that we're all exactly on the same page here. I'm hoping 100% universally you would say, yes, I still have to save this child's life, because is it sad that you're going to lose your nice outfit? Sure. That's a sacrifice, isn't it? But the point being made here is that if you can prevent a bad thing, but the sacrifice is not as important as the thing you're trying to prevent, then you should go ahead and still prevent that bad thing. So in this case, I boost up the level of sacrifice from just reaching out for a moment and taking a second out of your day to ruining an expensive outfit or clothes. But still, the loss of those clothes and outfit, etc., it's not as important as the life of a human being, so you should still prevent it. I told you that this really happened, and here's the backstory on that. There was a guy who was getting married, and he was in this full tuxedo as the groom, right? And he happened upon like a body of water that was nearby to the wedding site, and he actually had to ruin, the full tux and everything and go in and save the child's life. So, that's a very clear example, exactly in same terms as the author's hypothetical. But anyway, that's the principle laid out here. Now, what would be a comparable sacrifice that would eliminate this as an obligation? Well, if you had to wade into the water, but the water was circling by sharks, or if there were snipers up there pointing lasers at the body of water, then you might say, okay, well, I'd love to help the child, but not at the cost of my own life, because the sacrifice then cancels out with the nature of what has been prevented. But if what one must sacrifice is not on the level of that which is being prevented, then you should go ahead, because it's a net gain of utility in that case. Okay, so there's a little more. I want to finish working through this argument, and then there's just a couple of objections to it that are stated right after. But we're on track, so everything's going well. On Tuesday, we'll wrap this one up, and then we'll get through everything in the work of Garrett Hardin, who offers the opposite argument. So do keep reading through the syllabus. Keep reading through the book based on the syllabus. Try to get those articles in for Tuesday. And I'll be working grading your guys' first essay in the next week and 2 weeks. I'll be in touch with you as soon as I'm ready for your grades. So, all right, everyone, then. I guess I'll let you go. Take it easy. Thanks again. Let me know in the chat that that you have no other questions and that you're good for today. And then we can just close this one for now. Everything's good? I'm going to clear the board as I see. Okay, thanks, everybody. Thanks so much. Have a good weekend. If you need anything by email, feel free to email me anytime, and I'll be checking those messages. All right, guys, have a great one, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.